Rena Calloway found out her marriage was ending from a woman she had never liked, at a table set with her mother-in-law's good china, in front of 11 people who all seemed to already know. Vanessa Ashford Reed lifted her wine glass before the turkey had even been carved and said, brightly, as if she were toasting a promotion, well, since nobody else is going to say it, I will. To Callum, starting the new year as a free man. The table went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone already knows the ending except one person. Rena set down her fork. She looked at her husband of 9 years, who was suddenly very interested in the pattern on the tablecloth. Free man, she repeated, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her almost as much as the words had. Vanessa smiled the smile she'd worn since they were 26 and Rena had first walked into the Ashford family Christmas as an outsider who hadn't grown up knowing which fork was for the fish course. Oh, don't do that, Vanessa said. Don't make me the villain for saying what Callum should have told you weeks ago. Callum's mother, Marguerite, reached for her water glass with the studied calm of a woman who had rehearsed not reacting. Desmond Ashford, at the head of the table, did not look up from his plate at all, which told Rena more than anything Vanessa had said. Rena turned to her husband. Weeks ago, she said. Not a question. Callum finally met her eyes, and there was something in his face that might have been shame if he'd had the nerve to fully feel it. I was going to tell you after the holidays, he said. I didn't want to ruin Christmas for everyone. For everyone. Not for her. For everyone. She almost laughed at the precision of that slip. Rena had spent 9 years learning to read her husband the way she read a balance sheet, for the number that didn't match the story being told around it, and this was the clearest number she'd seen in months. He had not been protecting her feelings. He had been protecting his timeline. The dining room at Ashford House was the kind of room built to intimidate people into good behavior, 20-foot ceilings, and a chandelier that had been imported from a villa outside Florence, and Rena had always found it a little absurd that a family who made their fortune in industrial textiles needed a room that looked like a museum wing just to eat dinner in. Tonight, for the first time, she was grateful for the size of it. It meant there was enough air to think. How long have you known you wanted this? She asked Callum, quietly, the way you'd ask someone a question you already suspected the answer to and simply wanted confirmed out loud, in front of witnesses, so no one could later pretend it hadn't been said. Callum glanced at his sister, and that glance was its own confession. Since summer, he admitted. Maybe longer. Vanessa had the decency, or the cruelty, depending on how you looked at it, to look almost bored by the admission, as though she'd been waiting for this exact scene to finally happen and was mildly disappointed it wasn't more dramatic. There's someone else, Rena said. It wasn't a question either. Nobody at the table denied it. Nobody at the table said anything at all, which in a room full of Ashfords, a family that had never once in 9 years let a silence sit unmanaged, was its own kind of answer. Rena looked around the table slowly, at Marguerite's careful composure, at Desmond's fixed attention on his plate, at the 2 younger cousins pretending very hard to be absorbed in their phones, at Vanessa's satisfied stillness, and she understood, with the clean and almost peaceful clarity that sometimes arrives directly behind a shock, that every single person in this room had known before she did. They had let her walk into this dinner, sit down, fill her plate, and compliment the centerpiece, while carrying a secret they'd apparently agreed was safer to give to Vanessa's wine glass than to her directly. She thought of every year she had spent making herself smaller at this table, laughing at Desmond's jokes about modern women and their opinions, letting Marguerite correct her posture, letting Callum introduce her at company functions as my wife. She keeps the home running, when the truth, the actual and provable truth, was something none of them wanted spoken aloud in this house. Rena folded her napkin, set it beside her plate with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, and looked directly at Vanessa. Since you've opened the floor, she said, I have an announcement too. Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly, the way a smile does when it realizes the joke has changed hands. An announcement, she repeated, as if testing whether the phrase could still be funny. Rena did not raise her voice. She had learned, over 9 years of being underestimated at this exact table, that volume was for people who needed to be believed. She only needed to be accurate. 3 years ago, she said, when Desmond restructured the family trust to protect Ashford Textile Group from the downturn, he needed a controlling entity that could absorb debt without triggering a shareholder vote. Callum, do you remember whose name went on that entity? Callum's jaw tightened. He remembered. Of course he remembered. He had been the one who suggested it, back when their marriage still felt like a partnership instead of an arrangement he was quietly exiting. Meridian Heart Holdings, Rena continued, was structured in my maiden name, at my father's insistence, because he didn't trust family businesses that kept all their power in one bloodline. At the time, everyone thought it was a formality. A paper company. A tax convenience Desmond's lawyers drew up so the numbers looked clean. She let the silence stretch. Desmond had finally lifted his eyes from his plate. Rena, he said, in the low warning tone he used on junior executives who'd overstepped in a boardroom, this isn't the place. You're right, she agreed pleasantly. It's not. But Vanessa made this the place first, so I'm simply following the format she chose. Marguerite set down her fork with a small, precise click. What exactly are you saying, dear? I'm saying that Meridian Heart Holdings isn't a formality anymore. 2 years ago, when the mill in Danforth needed emergency capital and none of you wanted your names attached to that level of risk, I quietly converted my father's original stake into a controlling position. 51%. It's been sitting there ever since, in a company most of you forgot existed, because none of you ever asked me a single question about how the numbers kept working out in your favor. Vanessa laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. You're bluffing. I'm really not, Rena said. You can call Whitfield and Cross first thing Monday morning. Ask for the Meridian file. Ask them who signs off on every major capital decision this company has made since the Danforth acquisition. It isn't Desmond. It hasn't been for 2 years. The chandelier hummed faintly overhead, the only sound in a room that had, moments earlier, been performing casual holiday cruelty with total confidence. Now it held its breath. You never said anything, Callum said, and there was something almost wounded in his voice, as if her silence had been the betrayal and not his affair, not his months of planning an exit while she still packed his lunches and remembered his mother's medication schedule. No, Rena agreed. I didn't. I learned that from this family. I learned it very well, actually. You should be proud. Desmond's face had gone the particular gray of a man doing rapid math he didn't like the answer to. Even if that's true, he said carefully, a wife's holdings in a family trust are hardly grounds for a scene at Christmas dinner. You're right again, Rena said. It isn't a scene. It's context. Because in about 4 minutes, I'm going to tell you the second thing I found, which is the actual reason I asked my attorney to be on standby tonight, and that one, Desmond, is going to be a scene whether I want it to be or not. Vanessa's confidence had drained entirely out of her face now, replaced by something closer to calculation, the look of a woman trying to remember exactly what she had said to Rena in confidence over the past several months, and whether any of it could be used against her. Callum reached for Rena's hand under the table, an old reflex, muscle memory from years of being a teen before he decided he no longer wanted to be. She let him touch her wrist for exactly 1 second before she withdrew it. Not tonight, she said. You don't get comfort and an exit strategy in the same year. Desmond's phone buzzed on the table, face down, and he ignored it with the tight discipline of a man used to ignoring things until they went away on their own. It buzzed again. Rena watched him not look at it and felt, for the first time all night, something close to pity for the person he had become, a man so used to controlling every variable in a room that he had never learned what to do when a variable controlled itself. 6 months ago, Rena said, I noticed a discrepancy in the Danforth Mill's supplier contracts. Small at first. A vendor invoiced for maintenance work I had personally toured the facility and confirmed was never performed. I almost let it go, because I assumed it was clerical, the kind of sloppy paperwork that happens in a company this size. But I've spent 9 years reading numbers for a living, and numbers don't lie the way people do. They just wait for someone patient enough to ask them the right question. She reached into her bag, unhurried, and set a slim folder on the table beside her water glass, exactly the way she had once watched a stranger set an envelope down in front of her in a story she'd heard years ago and never forgotten, a story about evidence arriving before anyone was ready for it. That invoice led to 11 more like it, spread across 4 vendors, all routed through a shell logistics company registered to an address in Palm Beach. The address belongs to a rental property owned by a woman named Odette Kane. Callum's face went the color of the tablecloth. Vanessa's eyes moved fast between her brother and her sister-in-law, doing the math that everyone else at the table was already finishing. Odette Kane, Rena continued, is, according to the company directory Callum thinks I've never opened, a marketing consultant. Ashford Textile Group has been paying $18,000 a month for the past year and a half. I called the number listed for her firm. It's disconnected. I searched for her agency's registered business filings. They don't exist. What does exist, Desmond, is a woman your son has been seeing since early last year, whose rent, whose car lease, and whose recent trip to Positano were all quietly funneled through company funds, disguised as consulting fees, on invoices Callum approved without a single supporting document attached. That's not, Callum started, and then stopped, because there was nothing true he could put after those 2 words. It is exactly what it looks like, Rena said. I had it verified twice. Once by our internal auditor, who I asked to review the Danforth contracts under the pretense of a routine compliance sweep, and once privately, by a forensic accountant my father hired years before he died, a man he trusted enough to leave on retainer specifically in case anyone in this family ever tried what you just tried. Marguerite's hand had gone to her throat. Desmond, she said, and it wasn't a question, it was an accusation dressed as his name. Did you know about this? Desmond didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer, the kind Rena had gotten very good at reading tonight. I knew there were irregularities, he finally said. I assumed they'd be handled quietly. They will be, Rena said. Just not the way you assumed. She looked at Callum, who had not moved, who seemed to be waiting for the version of this dinner where his sister's cruel little toast was the worst thing that happened to him tonight. You wanted a free man, she said, echoing Vanessa's toast without a trace of the anger she actually felt, because anger, she had learned, was a currency and she intended to spend hers somewhere it would matter. You can have that. I'll sign whatever paperwork ends this marriage as fast as any attorney can draft it. But you should understand what you're walking into first. As of Monday morning, I intend to bring the Danforth contracts to the full board, along with the forensic report, and recommend an independent audit of every discretionary account you've had signing authority over for the last 2 years. You'd destroy the company to punish me, Callum said, low, like a threat dressed as a warning. No, Rena said. I'd save the company from you. There's a difference, and it's the same difference between what I've built here and what you've been quietly taking from it. Vanessa, who had started this entire evening with a toast meant to humiliate her, sat very still, visibly recalculating the value of every piece of gossip she'd traded with her brother over the past year, wondering how much of it now made her a witness instead of an ally. Desmond finally reached for his phone and read whatever waited there, and whatever it was drained the last of the color from his face. He set the phone down carefully, as if it had gotten heavier. That was Whitfield, he said quietly. He says you called him this afternoon. I did, Rena said. I wanted to confirm the paperwork was in order before I said anything tonight. I don't make announcements I can't back up. That's not how I was raised, and it's not how my father ran Meridian, even when it was small enough that nobody in this room thought it mattered. You went behind my back, Desmond said, and there was real anger in it now, the anger of a man discovering that the ground he'd stood on for 30 years had quietly been sold out from under him. I went around a wall, Rena corrected. You built the wall, Desmond, the day you decided the safest place to hide risk was in a woman's name, because you assumed a woman's name would never learn to read the documents attached to it. The dining room had gone fully silent except for the low crackle of the fire in the hearth behind Desmond's chair, a fire Marguerite had insisted on lighting every Christmas since Rena had known this family, a small ceremonial warmth in a house that otherwise ran cold. Nobody reached for the turkey. Nobody reached for anything. The cousins had stopped pretending to look at their phones and were simply staring, wide-eyed, at the adults they'd spent their whole lives assuming had this sort of thing figured out. What happens now? Marguerite asked, and for the first time all evening, her voice sounded like an actual mother's voice, frightened for her son, frightened for the family name that had always mattered to her more than almost anything else. That depends on what the board decides Monday, Rena said. I'll present the findings. I'll recommend Callum be suspended from any signing authority pending a full audit. I won't recommend criminal referral tonight, because I'd rather this family have the dignity of handling it internally, if it can still be handled with any dignity at all. But I want to be clear, that offer isn't permanent, and it isn't unconditional. Conditional on what? Callum asked, and his voice had lost the wounded quality from earlier, replaced now with something flatter, more resigned, the sound of a man realizing the version of events where he came out ahead had just quietly closed. On you not doing what your sister just did, Rena said, glancing at Vanessa, and turning this into a performance for sympathy. I'm not interested in punishing you publicly, Callum. I'm interested in making sure you never get the chance to do this to anyone else, in this family or outside it. There's a difference between consequences and cruelty, and I intend to stay on the correct side of that line, even though tonight would have made it very easy not to. Vanessa cleared her throat, and when she spoke, some of her earlier bravado had drained into something closer to caution. For what it's worth, she said, I didn't know about the money. I knew about Odette. I didn't know he was stealing to pay for her. I believe you, Rena said, and meant it, mostly, which is the only reason I'm not naming you in the board presentation Monday. But you should think very carefully, Vanessa, about what it means that you were willing to humiliate me at this table over an affair, without once wondering why your brother needed company funds to sustain it. You had half the story and used it as a weapon. I'd have thought harder before I did that, if I were you. Desmond stood slowly, both hands flat on the table, looking suddenly older than he had at the start of the evening. I think, he said, we should adjourn this dinner. I agree, Rena said, and rose as well, smoothing her napkin one final time before setting it on her empty chair. Merry Christmas, everyone. I mean that more sincerely than anyone here is probably able to hear right now. She turned and walked out of the dining room at Ashford House for what she already suspected would be one of the last times, and the sound of her heels against the marble floor was the only sound in the house behind her. The cold outside hit her like something clarifying rather than something cruel. Rena stood on the wide stone steps of Ashford House for a moment, breathing in air that smelled like wood smoke and the first hint of snow, and let herself feel, finally, what she had been holding back at that table for the better part of an hour. Not grief exactly. Something closer to the specific exhaustion of having carried a weight for a long time without realizing how heavy it had become, and then setting it down all at once. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A text from Theo Marsh, the forensic accountant her father had kept on retainer for exactly this kind of contingency, a man Rena had called 11 days earlier when the Danforth discrepancies first stopped looking like clerical errors. Confirmed everything in the report is airtight, he'd written. Whitfield's already drafting the audit request. You didn't need to say a word more than you did tonight. That was smart lawyering, not just anger. Rena read it twice and felt something in her chest unclench slightly. She had met Theo only 3 times in person, always across a conference table stacked with documents, always in the particular fluorescent hush of late-night forensic work, and in that time she had come to trust his judgment more than she had trusted almost anyone else's in the past several years, which said something uncomfortable about the state of her marriage that she hadn't let herself fully examine until this exact moment, standing alone on cold stone steps in a coat that suddenly felt too thin. She drove home through empty streets strung with other people's holiday lights, past houses glowing gold and warm, the kind of scene that would have made her sentimental in another year, and let herself cry only once, briefly, at a red light, not for Callum exactly, but for the version of the last 9 years she had convinced herself she was living, a version where quiet devotion eventually earned its return. She had believed, without ever quite admitting it to herself, that if she managed enough of the details, remembered enough of the birthdays, smoothed over enough of Desmond's cutting remarks, she would eventually be seen as something more than useful. Tonight had taught her the actual math of that arrangement. Usefulness, in a family like the Ashfords, was not a stage on the way to belonging. It was, for people who weren't born into the name, the entire relationship. The light turned green. She wiped her face with the back of one hand and kept driving. At home, the house was dark and quiet, the tree in the living room lit on a timer that clicked off automatically at 11, an absurd little detail that struck her, standing in the doorway in her coat, as almost funny. Even the lights in this house ran on a schedule that didn't ask her opinion. She poured a glass of wine she didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table where she had once spread out her father's old ledgers as a teenager, learning the language of numbers before she'd learned much of anything else, and opened her laptop. There was work to do before Monday, and doing the work, she was discovering, felt considerably better than sitting with the alternative, which was simply feeling everything the dinner had unearthed all at once. She reread the forensic report line by line, cross-checked the Palm Beach Shell Company against the property records Theo had pulled, confirmed the wire transfer dates against the board's approved discretionary spending limits, and by 1 a.m. she had a presentation clean enough to survive any objection Desmond's attorneys might throw at it Monday. She thought, at one point, of calling her mother, long gone now, and telling her what had happened, the way she used to narrate small victories into a phone that no longer had anyone on the other end of it, and found, surprisingly, that she didn't need to. She already knew what her mother would have said. She could hear it clearly enough without dialing anything at all. You built something they couldn't see because they never once thought to look. Now let them look. Rena closed the laptop a little after 2, finally let herself feel tired instead of sharp, and went to bed in a house that, for the first time in years, felt entirely and only hers. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock Monday morning in the same glass-walled conference room where Rena had sat through 100 quarterly reviews, always positioned at the edges, always introduced as Callum's wife before anyone remembered she held a seat on the trust that ultimately controlled the company's largest asset. This time, she arrived first. She set up her presentation herself, connected her own laptop, arranged the printed packets in a neat stack at the center of the table, and stood at the head of the room, in the chair Desmond usually occupied, when the rest of the board began filing in. Nobody told her to move. Nobody quite had the nerve. Desmond arrived last, flanked by 2 attorneys Rena recognized from the firm that had handled the family's most sensitive matters for decades, men whose presence was meant to signal that this meeting would be fought, not simply endured. Callum did not come at all, which Rena had half expected and fully preferred. His absence was, in its own way, the clearest confession the room would get all morning. Before we begin, Desmond said, settling into a chair at the far end of the table instead of his usual seat, a small surrender Rena noted without comment, I want the record to reflect that this family intends to cooperate fully with whatever process the board deems appropriate. It was, Rena thought, a remarkably careful sentence for a man who 2 nights earlier had told her this wasn't the place to bring any of it up. She walked the board through the findings without embellishment, because embellishment was for people who weren't confident their evidence spoke for itself. The invoices. The Shell Company. The Palm Beach address. The wire transfers timed suspiciously close to Odette Kane's known travel dates, dates Theo had cross-referenced against social media posts the woman apparently hadn't thought to make private. Board members who had known Rena for years, who had shaken her hand at holiday parties and asked politely how she was enjoying being a wife and mother to nobody's children in particular, watched her present 18 months of embezzlement with the same flat, technical precision she might have used to explain a supply chain delay, and she watched something shift in their expressions as she spoke, the particular recalibration of people realizing they had badly misjudged someone's competence for a very long time. The recommendation, she said, closing the presentation, is an immediate suspension of Callum Ashford's signing authority, a full independent audit of all discretionary accounts under his control for the past 24 months, and referral to outside counsel to determine whether any of this rises to the level requiring disclosure to regulators, Given that Ashford Textile Group is publicly financed through institutional debt with disclosure obligations attached. One of Desmond's attorneys started to object, something about due process and the danger of overcorrecting on the basis of a single internal report, but the chief financial officer, a woman named Priscilla Voss who had worked alongside Rena on 3 separate audits over the years and trusted her completely, cut him off before he finished the sentence. "I've reviewed Mrs. Calloway's findings independently over the weekend," Priscilla said. "They're accurate. I'd stake my own signature on it." The vote, when it came, was not close. 9 in favor of suspension and audit, 2 abstentions, Desmond among them, unwilling to vote against his own son but unable, given everything now on the record, to vote in his favor either. Rena had expected the vote to feel triumphant. Instead it felt clarifying, the way finishing a long and necessary surgery feels clarifying, useful rather than victorious. As the room emptied, Desmond lingered near the door, waiting until it was just the 2 of them. "You could have destroyed him quietly," he said. "Without any of this becoming public record." "I could have," Rena agreed. "But quiet is how this family has handled every uncomfortable truth for 30 years, and quiet is exactly how Callum thought he'd get away with it. I'm done being the person who keeps things quiet so everyone else stays comfortable." Desmond studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, grudging and unfamiliar, might have been respect. "Your father would have been proud of this," he said finally. "I know," Rena said. "That's part of why I did it." The weeks that followed moved faster than Rena expected, and slower than she needed at the same time, the strange dual speed of a life being dismantled and rebuilt simultaneously. The divorce filing went uncontested within days. Callum, facing a criminal referral he could not afford to complicate with a messy custody battle over assets he no longer had a legal claim to, signed everything Rena's attorney sent him without argument. He moved into a rented apartment across town, the kind of place Rena imagined he'd once have described as beneath him, and the last she heard, Odette Kane had stopped returning his calls the same week the audit findings became public knowledge among the small, gossiping circle of people who ran in the Ashford's social orbit. Word traveled fast in that world, faster than any of them liked to admit, and reputations that had taken decades to build could apparently unravel over the course of a single dinner. Vanessa called twice in January, and Rena let both calls go to voicemail before finally picking up the third. "I owe you an apology," Vanessa said, without preamble, which was, Rena had to admit, more directness than she'd expected from a woman who'd spent most of her adult life weaponizing implication instead of saying things outright. "I used what I knew to hurt you before I understood the full picture, and that was cruel regardless of what Callum did." Rena considered the apology for a moment, turning it over, checking it the way she checked a number before trusting it. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally. "I'm not sure it changes much between us right now, but I appreciate it." "That's fair," Vanessa said. There was a pause, and then, quieter, "For what it's worth, most of the family thinks you were right to do what you did. Even the ones who'd never say it to your face." "That doesn't surprise me," Rena said. "Being right quietly has always been more comfortable for this family than being right loudly." The forensic audit, once fully completed, revealed the theft had run closer to $400,000 over 18 months, funneled not only to Odette's rent and travel but to a second shell account Callum had apparently opened to cover gambling debts he'd never disclosed to anyone, debts that predated the affair by nearly 2 years. Reading that section of the final report, Rena felt something she hadn't expected, a kind of distant sorrow for the version of Callum she had married, a man who had once stayed up with her until 3 a.m. building financial models for a company his father doubted would survive its first decade, a man who had believed in her work before anyone else outside her own family had. That man had not vanished all at once, in one bad decision. He had eroded slowly, over years of praise he hadn't earned and money he hadn't been required to account for, until there was almost nothing left of the person she'd first fallen for except the charm, which had apparently been load-bearing all along. She mourned that version of him privately, in the same way she might mourn a friend who had moved somewhere she could no longer visit, without confusing the mourning for a wish to have him back. The regulators, once notified, opened a formal inquiry into Ashford Textile Group's disclosure practices, a process that would take months to resolve and cost the company significantly in legal fees and reputational damage. Consequences Desmond bore with a grim, aged silence Rena found she didn't particularly enjoy watching, even after everything. She had not wanted to burn the company down. She had wanted, more specifically and more simply, to stop protecting people who had never once considered protecting her. Meridian Heart Holdings, meanwhile, continued exactly as it had for the past 2 years, quietly controlling the capital structure that kept Ashford Textile Group solvent, except now everyone in the boardroom understood precisely whose signature that stability depended on, and addressed her accordingly, without the old, careless assumption that competence and quietness were mutually exclusive qualities in the same person. Theo Marsh called in February, on a Thursday evening, ostensibly to walk her through the final regulatory filing, though the conversation lasted considerably longer than the filing required and drifted, by the end, into subjects that had nothing to do with audits at all. He asked how she was sleeping. He asked, carefully, whether she'd eaten dinner, and when she admitted she hadn't, insisted on staying on the phone while she made something, describing his own attempt at the same recipe with enough self-deprecating detail that she found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in weeks. It was a small thing, being asked an ordinary question and having someone actually wait for the answer, but Rena had gone so long without it that the smallness of it landed like something much larger. She thought, hanging up that night, of how strange it was that the person who had shown up with evidence instead of comfort, who had never once told her everything would be fine, who had simply handed her the facts and trusted her to know what to do with them, had ended up being the one who made her feel most steady. Callum, in 9 years, had rarely trusted her with difficult truths. He had managed her, gently and persistently, the way you might manage a business partner whose feelings needed careful handling to keep the arrangement running smoothly. Theo had never once tried to manage her. He simply told her what he knew and let her be as capable as she actually was. They began having dinner occasionally, always framed at first as work, a debrief over the ongoing regulatory process, a check-in on how the board transition was progressing, until the framing became a formality neither of them bothered maintaining by early spring. He never rushed her. When she mentioned, one evening, that she wasn't ready to think seriously about another relationship, still raw from watching one marriage dissolve into a spreadsheet of fraudulent invoices, he simply nodded and said that was fine, that he wasn't going anywhere, and meant it in a way that didn't feel like pressure disguised as patience, the way Callum's patience had so often turned out to be, in retrospect, simply waiting. By April, Ashford Textile Group had weathered the worst of the regulatory scrutiny, emerging with a settlement, a new compliance framework, and a board that had, in a quiet but unmistakable restructuring, elevated Rena from a peripheral trust holder to an active voting seat with expanded oversight authority, a formal acknowledgement of what had, in practice, already been true for years. Desmond, older now in ways that seemed to have arrived overnight, had begun deferring to her judgment in meetings with a kind of chastened respect he'd never shown when she was simply Callum's wife sitting quietly at the edge of the table. It was not the vindication she might have imagined, years earlier, when she still believed vindication was the thing she wanted most. It felt, instead, like something plainer and more durable, the simple, unglamorous experience of being taken seriously by people who had spent a decade assuming she didn't need to be. Marguerite sent a card that spring, brief and formal, thanking Rena for handling everything with more grace than the family had any right to expect, and Rena kept the card in a drawer without quite deciding whether she'd ever write back. Some relationships, she was learning, didn't need a clean resolution to be finished. They could simply end, quietly, the way a chapter ends, without a final confrontation to give it shape. She had spent enough of her life engineering closure for other people's comfort. She no longer felt obligated to provide it here. A year passed the way years do after an upheaval, in a sequence of ordinary Tuesdays that gradually, almost without her noticing, stopped feeling like recovery and simply started feeling like life. Rena moved out of the house she and Callum had shared, not because she couldn't afford to stay, but because she wanted a home that hadn't been furnished around someone else's preferences, and found a smaller place near the water, with a kitchen table large enough for ledgers and takeout containers in equal measure. She kept her father's old company name on the door of her new office at Ashford Textile Group's headquarters, not out of sentiment exactly, though there was some of that too, but because Meridian Hart Holdings had become, in the space of a single Christmas dinner and everything that followed it, something the entire industry now watched closely, a controlling stake that had quietly outlasted the marriage it was built to protect. She was invited, that spring, to speak at an industry conference on corporate governance and family business risk, a panel she initially declined out of habit before Theo pointed out, gently, that declining opportunities to be visible was exactly the pattern she'd spent the last year trying to unlearn. She accepted. She stood on a stage in front of 400 people and told a version of her own story stripped of names and specifics, a story about what happens when institutions build their safety nets out of people they never expect to look closely at the fine print, and watched a room full of strangers nod along with an intensity that told her the story was more common than she'd ever let herself believe while she was living inside it. Afterward, a young woman approached her at the reception, nervous, holding a business card too tightly. "I think my husband's been doing something similar with our joint accounts," she said quietly. "I don't know how to even start looking." Rena gave her Theo's number, and her own, and told her the only thing she wished someone had told her years earlier. "Start by assuming you're allowed to ask questions about money that has your name attached to it, even if everyone around you acts like the question is rude. It isn't rude. It's due diligence, and you're entitled to it." The woman thanked her, eyes bright, and Rena watched her walk away and felt something settle into place that had been unsettled since that Christmas dinner, a sense that the entire ordeal, painful and public as it had been, had turned into something with a use beyond her own life. Callum, she heard eventually through the same slow channel of mutual acquaintances that had once carried gossip about his affair, had taken a position at a smaller firm 2 states away, a quiet demotion from the life he'd once assumed was permanently his, and had, according to Vanessa, who called occasionally now with an ease that had grown between them over the year, stopped mentioning Odette's name entirely, as though the affair that had once felt worth destroying a marriage for had simply evaporated once it no longer came with company funds attached. Rena felt, hearing this, less satisfaction than she might have predicted a year earlier, and more a kind of tired clarity, the sense of a chapter that had genuinely closed rather than one she was still forcing shut through sheer force of will. Theo proposed in October, at the same seaside restaurant where they'd had their first dinner that hadn't pretended to be about work, and he did it in the exact register Rena had come to expect from him, which was to say without theater, without an audience, without a single element designed to make the moment about anyone's performance but their own private one. "I want to be clear about something before you answer," he said, turning the small box over once in his hands before opening it. "I'm not offering you rescue. You never needed that, and I'd never insult you by pretending you did. I'm offering you a partner who already knows exactly how capable you are, and wants to build an ordinary life next to that capability instead of in spite of it." Rena thought, hearing that, of every year she had spent making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's comfort, of a dining room with a 20-foot ceiling and a chandelier from Florence, of a husband who had needed her competence but resented having to acknowledge it, of a family that had hidden its risk inside her name because they assumed she'd never learn to read the fine print attached to her own signature. She thought of how far the distance was between being useful to someone and being chosen by them, and how she had spent nearly a decade mistaking the first for the second. "Yes," she said, and meant it entirely, without the small, private hesitation she might have expected from herself a year earlier, back when trust still felt like a transaction she wasn't sure she could afford to make again. They married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the same seaside restaurant, a low-key gathering that included Priscilla Voss from the board, a small handful of colleagues who had become genuine friends over the past 2 years, and, somewhat to Rena's surprise, Vanessa, who cried during the toast and apologized again, unprompted, for the Christmas dinner that had started everything, an apology Rena accepted this time without reservation, because enough time had passed and enough had changed for the apology to mean something more than damage control. Desmond did not attend, sending instead a brief, formal note wishing her well, which Rena read once, folded neatly, and filed away without particular feeling either way, a closure that didn't require warmth to still count as complete. Standing at the water's edge afterward, her new husband's hand loosely wrapped around hers, Rena thought about the version of herself who had sat frozen at that Christmas table 2 years earlier, absorbing the news of her own divorce from a sister-in-law's cruel toast before she'd had the chance to hear it from anyone who actually owed her the truth. That woman had believed, without quite admitting it to herself, that her worth in that family was measured entirely by how much she could quietly carry without complaint. It had taken losing almost everything that family offered her to finally understand that the carrying itself had never been the value. The value had been hers all along, sitting patiently in a company most of them had forgotten existed, waiting for the moment she finally decided to stop hiding it for everyone else's comfort. She had not needed revenge to prove that. She had only needed to stop protecting the people who had never once thought to protect her, and to say, clearly, in a room that had assumed her silence was permanent, exactly what she had built, and exactly what she was no longer willing to pretend she hadn't. Sometimes, in the quiet stretch of an evening when Theo was reading in the next room and the water outside their new house had gone still and dark, Rena found herself thinking back to the specific texture of that Christmas dinner, not the humiliation of it, which had faded faster than she expected, but the strange clarity that had arrived directly behind the shock, the sense of every piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving suddenly clicking into a shape she could finally see. Whole. She had spent so many years assuming that patience was the same thing as strength, that if she simply endured enough, absorbed enough, smoothed over enough friction on other people's behalf, the endurance itself would eventually be recognized as a kind of quiet heroism. It had taken a cruel toast over Christmas china to teach her the actual difference between patience and permission, between being trusted with responsibility and being trusted with respect, and how a family, or a marriage, or an entire institution could extract the first from you for years while carefully withholding the second. She did not regret those years entirely. They had taught her, after all, to read a balance sheet the way other people read a room, to notice the small inconsistency that meant a larger story was hiding underneath it, a skill that had ultimately protected far more than her own dignity when it finally came time to use it. But she had promised herself, standing on those cold stone steps outside Ashford House the night everything changed, that she would never again mistake her own silence for a form of strength. Silence, she had learned, was useful to everyone except the person keeping it. Vanessa visited that winter, the first anniversary of the wedding approaching, and the two of them sat on the porch with tea, an image that would have seemed impossible to Rena 2 years earlier, watching the water the way people watch something they've finally stopped needing to control. Do you ever think about how different that Christmas would have gone if I hadn't said anything? Vanessa asked, and there was genuine curiosity in it now, not the old performance of concern that used to accompany her questions. Rena considered it honestly. I think Callum would have found some other way to tell me eventually, on his own terms, in whatever version made him look least responsible for any of it. I think the Danforth contracts would have surfaced sooner or later regardless, because numbers like that don't stay hidden forever, not once someone's actually looking. I think I would have found my way to the same conclusion, just slower, and probably with less of an audience. Would that have been better? Vanessa asked. Quieter, maybe, Rena said. Better, I'm honestly not sure. There's something to be said for finding out exactly who someone is, all at once, in a room full of people who can't quietly pretend they didn't see it happen. It's a brutal way to learn something. But at least it's an honest one. Vanessa nodded slowly, turning her tea in her hands. For what it's worth, I think everyone at that table learned something about you that night. I don't think any of us had any idea what you'd actually built, quietly, for years, right under everyone's nose. That was rather the point, Rena said, and there was no bitterness left in it now, just the flat, settled honesty of someone describing a fact she'd made peace with. Nobody in that family ever thought to ask me a real question about the company, because nobody in that family ever thought I was worth asking. I let them believe that for a long time, because it was easier than fighting a version of myself they'd already decided on. I'm not interested in being underestimated quietly anymore. It cost me 9 years the first time. I don't plan on paying that price twice. The two women sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the tide move in and out with the same patient indifference it always had, unconcerned with any family's fortune or any marriage's ending, and Rena thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the worst night of her life had also, eventually, turned out to be the night everything actually began. She had not needed to become someone crueler or louder to survive it. She had only needed to stop making herself smaller for people who had never once, in 9 years, considered making room for her instead. That was the whole of it. In the end, the entire lesson folded into a single Christmas dinner and everything that came after it. Quiet competence, unclaimed for long enough, does not disappear. It simply waits, patiently, in whatever name you left it under, for the moment you finally decide to say it out loud, in a room that assumed you never would. She thought of her father sometimes, in moments like this, and imagined what he might have said watching her walk out of that dining room 2 years ago with her head level and her voice steady, carrying a folder that quietly rewrote everyone's understanding of who actually held the power in that family. He had never believed in loud victories. He had believed in the kind that simply held, year after year, long after anyone stopped paying attention to the paperwork behind them. Rena set her tea down, watched the last light fade over the water, and understood, finally and without any lingering doubt, that she had built exactly that kind of victory herself, patiently, quietly, in a name nobody thought to question until the night she finally, truly, fully chose to speak it herself.